Hi everyone, it's Nick again, back with another tier list. Today, I am going to be ranking the films of Sir Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock is one of my personal favorite directors, and there are a lot of films that we have to go through. He directed 53 films, so we're going to go ahead and talk about them on the tier list. This video might not be as polished as the rest of the tier lists, just because there's so many different films that we have to get into. There just isn't enough time. It's important that we talk about all of Alfred Hitchcock's films. You don't want to rank Hitchcock's films without having seen all of them. While you may see the particular favorites, and they're the favorites for a reason, you still should see the rest of them to see the development of him as a filmmaker and be able to judge for yourself whether or not you like his earlier work compared to his later work. We're going to be talking about 55 different movies. That's a ton of movies. By the way, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content on the channel. So I divided the tier list as you can see. The first bottom tier is Lost. These are Alfred Hitchcock's lost or incomplete films. There's only 2 films on this list, and we will get through them pretty quickly because there's nothing there. He didn't finish the films, but I still wanted to add them to his feature film filmography because he did start them. There are photographs of them, but they were not completed. So that's why they belong in the bottom Lost tier. The next tier on this list, this might be a little controversial. I decided to make Silent its own tier by itself. And I put it at the bottom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better than the next tier up. But he's less known for the silent films, so I feel like it makes sense to put the silent films in its own tier at the bottom of the list. It's still above Lost. The next tier is rubbish. These are the Alfred Hitchcock films with sound that I think aren't as good as the rest of his films. I think these films are pretty mediocre. They're kind of boring and they're not really engaging. The next tier is the Good Evening tier. This tier, I think, these are the films that are pretty good. That being said, I'm not a huge fan of these films. These films could be better. I think they're good films and I think they're pretty engaging, but I do feel like even though they're not rubbish, they're not as clever and as memorable as his other films. These are the films that are mid-level. These are the mid-level, pretty good movies. The next tier on the list is the Very Clever tier. These are the Alfred Hitchcock films that I think are very good. I think these are some of his finest films. The Very Clever tier is the films that aren't the films that everyone thinks about and talks about, but are probably almost, if not just as good as those films that we all know for him. The second to last tier is the Hitchcockian tier. Now, these are the films that are the quintessential Hitchcock movies that I think everyone agrees are pretty much his best films. They're popular for a reason because the filmmaking in those films is top notch. These are just his quintessential films. And the top tier on the tier list is the personal favorites tier. These are my personal favorite Alfred Hitchcock movies. We're about to get started into the tier list. Like I said, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content on Lawless films. Let's get right into it. The 55th film on the list is the film number 13. Now, number 13 is an unfinished film. There's not really much to go into it. It stopped mid-production. And the reason why it's the worst film on his list is because this is the only film that he never really finished. The 54th film on the Alfred Hitchcock tier list is The Mountain Eagle. And this film was completed, but unfortunately it was lost. So we can't really talk about it that much. Now we're going to move on to the silent tier. These are Alfred Hitchcock's silent films, and now this is where we get really into the tier list because now we actually talk about the films that I've seen. So let's get right into it. Starting at the bottom of the silent tier, the 53rd film on the tier list, The Ring. And The Ring is about these 2 boxers vying for this one woman's affection, but It's kind of cringe. The film is pretty dated and a little racist. The female character is kind of unlikable. It's just really not as engaging, and you don't really care about the characters as much as the rest of them. It's just unlikable characters in a situation that we've seen better before, so that's why it's at the bottom of the silent tier. The next film on the list is Easy Virtue. Easy Virtue looked pretty grainy, and it was a very uninteresting plot. The dilemma is that of its time. The reveal scene in the film is the film's best part, where she reveals that she was a divorcee. The 51st film on the ranking is Downhill. So Downhill, it's about this boy who kind of takes the fall for this other boy at like boarding school and gets expelled. So he kind of like goes around and tries to like make it on his own, and falls for a lady, but then he ends up being way over in his head, and then he resorts back to the school because I think they made amends or they found out. It's a decent film. It's kind of boring. I think the characters are better than the previous films. Not really much there going on. Downhill is a kind of a basic movie. The 50th film on the list is Champagne. Champagne is a pretty interesting film. It's about society and class. It has its funny moments. It has its good set pieces. This is probably his last generic silent film, so his other silent films I think are a little bit better. But Champagne has its funny moments, especially the ending gets pretty funny. The different shots inside the restaurant gala that they were at was pretty nice as well. The 49th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, and the next film on the silent tier is The Pleasure Garden. Now, The Pleasure Garden is his first film, and it's a pretty interesting film because he uses different colors through the lens and the different textures that I think really add to the story. It's more visually engaging, and it's about a love square. So you know how some films have like a love triangle? This one has a love square. It's fine, you know, that's why it's above the rest of them, but still. The 48th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking and the next film on the silent tier is The Farmer's Wife. Now, The Farmer's Wife is a pretty funny film. It's about this farmer whose wife dies, so like he's vying for a new wife, but then he ends up marrying the woman that he's supposed to marry the entire time. And it's funny because throughout the film he's picking these different wives who are very different in their own way, and they're all very like uninterested and very shocked by what the farmer does to vie for their attention. But then at the very last second, and they all get like kind of jealous, so they kind of want the farmer at the very end, and it's kind of a funny how it switches like that so quickly. The 47th film on the list and the next film on the silent tier is The Manxman. The Manxman is a really kind of dramatic, very dramatic film that I think is very fun to watch, and it's one of his better silent films. This is his second best silent film, I think. The film is about these two guys. They're friends, and one guy gets the attention of this young, attractive woman, but unfortunately, his friend is very jealous because he was also interested in the woman. However, one guy goes off to war, and then his girlfriend thinks that he died in war, so then the girlfriend ends up getting hitched with his friend, but then the friend gets a letter from the man that just pretty much says, "Oh, they thought I died in war, but I ended up not dying, and I'm coming home now." And it's very like straightforward like that, which when I saw that on screen, I thought that was hysterical. But probably the most fun silent film, the film that probably, you know, really like made him well known as a filmmaker, is the 46th film on the Alfred Hitchcock list, and the top film in the silent tier, that is The Lodger, a story of the London fog. This film is about Jack the Ripper. It's a very interesting, dramatic film. It's very suspenseful. I like how Alfred Hitchcock played with like the newspaper reel throughout the news about Jack the Ripper or the man killing everyone. the news spreading from the newspaper and the newspaper traveling to different people reading it. I think that's a very powerful sequence to showcase his ability to transcend information and move the plot forward. And the scene with all the people in the newsroom is actually interesting because that's just the crew, because at this point, you know, like Alfred Hitchcock doesn't have money for extras, so like he pretty much hired the crew, he had the crew members behaving in that way just to play as background actors in those moments. This film's easily his most polished silent film, so I think that's why this belongs at the top of the silent tier. It's suspenseful, it has its comedic moments, and I think that's what makes it such a good showcase of Alfred Hitchcock's talent as a filmmaker. It kind of propelled Alfred Hitchcock into stardom and kind of gave him more freedom as a filmmaker to make the films that he wanted to make. We're going to go on to the rubbish tier. Now, these are the Alfred Hitchcock films that I think are kind of bad. The 45th film on the list and the first film in the rubbish tier is Juno and the Peacock. This film, you can clearly tell that it was a stage play. The resolution and film grain is so apparent in this film, and the audio is very bad. The story is pretty memorable, and it's kind of interesting about the certain class of people when you think this man has came into a lot of money and how differently the family treats him. It's interesting seeing that dynamic, but that only goes so far when you can barely hear what anyone's saying, and where you can barely see what anyone's saying too, and where it kind of feels like a stage play because everything feels so staged and blocked compared to Alfred Hitchcock's other films where the camera is so dynamic. This film, the camera takes a major backseat, and I think this film is uniquely bad. So I think that's why Juno and the Peacock is the bottom of the Alfred Hitchcock list in terms of his films where there's sound and you have characters talking. So sorry, Hitchcock, but not your best work. The 44th film on the list is Maury, and Maury is basically a shot-by-shot remake of his film Murder, which I have above this film. So let's talk about Murder. The 43rd film on the list is Murder! Exclamation point. The only reason why I have this film higher than Maury is because Maury is in German and this film's in English, and I speak English, so I just think it's better for me and easier for me to understand. It's less of an inconvenience. But other than that, these films are nearly identical. It's the same film. And what the film is this murder happens at this like little hotel hostel thing. The police arrest the suspect, but this one actor is on the case and he's convinced that the woman is actually innocent because he's able to piece out the scenario in his head as to what happened. This man ends up being on the jury, and he actually feels guilty about convicting the woman because in hindsight, he realizes that she couldn't have done it. So then he feels remorse and guilt. So then he goes on the case to try to figure out who's actually responsible. Honestly, it's kind of shocking how boring this film is because the beginning takes kind of long to when it doesn't have to be that long. The setup to the conflict is actually the best part, to see what's happening during the scene of the crime, to see all the different perspectives and understand the different perspectives. But then when you're slowly piecing it together with the guy, you're kind of one step ahead of him slightly the entire time, it seems like, or you can probably deduce what's coming next. The 42nd film on the list is The Skin Game. This film is about these two like elite families. This one man wants to buy part of this other man's land so that he can bulldoze like all the land down. This film has a very good auction scene where there's a fun little auction going on, and like the one rich guy tricks the other rich guy into like auctioning off his land to him. But then like the film takes kind of a tragic turn because I think the daughter of the rich man trying to bulldoze everything down ends up killing herself and commits suicide or something like that. Something very dramatic like that. At number 41, we have Strauss's Great Waltz. Now, this film is about this young conductor trying to aspire to be as good of a conductor as his father, but he lives in his father's shadow and doesn't get the same recognition from his father that he feels like he should. He runs into this one girl, and then she ends up helping him because she's able to convince everyone about his one piece of music that's really good. At the end, they play the music. He gets some respect from his father, not full respect, but some respect. It's pretty generic. Like I said again, it's pretty generic. I have this one higher than the other ones simply because I think the music's pretty good. I think the Blue Dabinue also plays in this film too, which is a lovely song. I love that song a lot. So number 40, we have East of Shanghai. The other title for this film is called Rich and Strange. What this film is about, this couple, I think they're married. They might not be married yet. I think they are married. And they decide they're in London, and London's really boring, so they decided to go like a cross-world cruise vacation. And when they're on the cruise that goes throughout the Middle East and Asia, they each fall for someone else that's not each other. The guy falls for this young attractive woman, and the female talks to this respectable gentleman, and they kind of drift apart. And it's kind of awkward because they're supposed to be together, but they're spending this vacation away from each other. But in the end, they slightly reconcile, and they get back together when they realize that the couples weren't interested in either one of them. And then they kind of get stranded on a boat when the boat starts sinking, and then they have to get rescued, and then they're back in London, and it's kind of like a story about these horrible people going on vacation. And that's what makes this movie very difficult, is that the guy especially is just so unlikable that you don't sympathize with them, and it's very hard to get through the film. I do think the set pieces are what makes the film better than the previous films on the list, and there are pretty funny comedic moments, especially near the end of the film, that I think kind of save it in some way. Number 39 is Blackmail. Blackmail is the first talking film for Hitchcock, and I think potentially one of the first talking films ever. This woman kills this man with a knife in self-defense, but there's a witness, and then the witness decides to blackmail her, and so she tells this other guy about the situation. It's a pretty interesting film. It's engaged. It has a fun premise, so that's why it's higher than the other films. The sound's better than Juno and the Paycock and some of the other films, but the sound quality is still not particularly good. It's a fun blackmail story that's pretty straightforward, so if you like that, I'd check that one out. But if not, then we can just move on to next on the list, and that is the 38th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, Young and Innocent. This film is about this young man really, who's just been falsely accused. You're gonna see a running theme throughout these Hitchcock films, and that's false accusations, murders, love triangles, and policemen failing at their jobs. Those things are throughout all Hitchcock films. You're going to see a lot of that as we go through this list, just fair warning. But it's about this young man who's been falsely accused of strangling this other woman or person on the beach. He was in proximity to the crime, and people saw him there, but they didn't see the actual murderer. They assume it's him, even though it's not. And the rest of the film is him, the female character that's obviously his love interest, working with him to try to prove his innocence. The climax of the film is a very cringe scene that involves blackface. Real criminal is this musician that has a tick, or kind of tell with his face, or I think he sneezes. The climax takes place in this club, and the musician's actually there performing, but he's wearing blackface, so you can't really tell it's him. So that's why they kind of have to go back to the room and kind of watch him do his little facial tick before they're able to determine that that's the actual guy behind the blackface. Hitchcock uses blackface in this film as kind of a disguise, So that's kind of cringe. So that's why the film's a little dated. And, besides that, it's a pretty straightforward, false accusation film. He's made better ones. So, we can talk about them and not spend too much time on this one. Number 37, I have Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Now, this film is not the Mr. and Mrs. Smith that you probably think of. You probably think of the Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And those films are about Mr. and Mrs. Smith being secret spies, but this is not that. This first Mr. and Mrs. Smith film is about this married couple who realize that they're actually not married. There's a technicality within the state where they were married, where it's technically, their marriage is technically not legitimate. So this married couple who thinks they've been married actually aren't married. And so when that news breaks, they kind of have a disagreement in the process, and they kind of decide that they don't want to actually ever get married. And so immediately, once the woman decides that she doesn't want to get married to the husband instantly regrets what he says and tries to win her back, but she already finds this other guy. But then the entire film is him trying to sabotage their relationship. The film ends with them in the cabin, but she takes her boyfriend, but then he still comes too. He tries to buy her affections back by pretending to be sick, and it kind of initially works at first because she thinks he's sick, but then she looks over and then she realizes that he was faking it. So they kind of end where she broke off with the other guy and is still at an impasse with her former husband, but it seems like they have the ability to still work it out. So it kind of ends unresolved, which you think would be that bad, but it's actually not that bad for the film in terms of how the story was structured. It's an interesting Hitchcock film because it's pretty different from his usual work. It's kind of generic, and it's not what we really think of when you think of Hitchcock. So that's why it's number 37. Number 36 is the film Number 17. Now, this film is actually pretty short. It's less than an hour long. I think it's 48 minutes, but I really like how the film is structured. You're left in the dark in the very beginning. You're in this one warehouse location, and more people enter the warehouse location, but you're not really left with any context. And you realize that these people don't have context as to who each of them are, and it's them trying to piece out what actually is going on at this place. It's pretty straightforward. Event is as soon as you figure it out, but it's kind of nice how the film starts when you're kind of left in the dark. It's a nice change of pace where you're usually seeing oh, here's Bill. This is Bill's story. Let's follow Bill throughout his day. That's how most films start, or they'll have a scene that's out of context and then they'll cut away and then they'll bring you into context. But Number 17 is all out of context, and it slowly brings you into context. And it's a very, very fun, refreshing film in that regard. And the climax of the film that takes place on this train is actually very cool too. And so it's a very fun set piece for the climax, and it's a very fun premise. So that's why I have it higher than the rest of the films. It is kind of short, so that's kind of a knockoff of it. I definitely like number 17. If you like Hitchcock, I recommend checking it out. At number 35, we have the film Sabotage. Now, Sabotage is another kind of short film, but it's not as short as number 17. It starts on the city streets, and it starts in this movie theater. All the lights go out, all the power goes out, and all the movie theater patrons go to the stand trying to get a refund. But before that happens, the lights turn back on. And in the process, you realize that there's another man that's also living in the same building / area of the movie theater. And the guy who owns the movie theater becomes aware that that one man sabotaged the lights for a specific reason. And like I said, a lot of films are normal people stepping out of their normal comfort zone and trying to do jobs that you normally see a detective or a policeman do, but they're taking matters into their own hands. And that's similar to this one, where it's more engaging than the rest of the films. There is this fun, suspenseful moment with a ticking time bomb on the bus. The guy who gives the person the bomb thinks that he'll deliver the bomb in a timely fashion, but one thing leads to another, and then he ends up being late. And then throughout the entire time, you're seeing the clock ticking, and that creates suspense for the film, and I think that's very effective in that respect. That's Sabotage. I have it higher because I like the movie theater setting. I like the suspense with the ticking time bomb. The premise is more interesting than the rest of the previous films. Moving on to number 34, Secret Agent. This film is pretty good. It's just about this guy who works as a secret agent. I think he lives in London, and he has to travel to like Germany or Switzerland to solve this case. And then his female companion, who he runs into, actually is also a secret agent working with him that he soon discovers. And he also has another guy who's there who's working with them too. They're trying to figure out who's responsible, who's the criminal. They have their one suspect, and so they try to confront that one suspect on like a ski slope where one man's like looking out trying to like prove that the guy is the criminal. But however, like there's a bait and switch, because the person that they think initially is the criminal actually isn't, and one person that they talk to throughout the entire film is actually the bad guy. But you can kind of already tell that that's where they're going halfway through the film. You're like, okay, that guy's actually not a bad guy. This guy's actually the bad guy. You kind of have to wait for the film to get to that point. So you kind of already know the twist before it happens. This film also has another climax that takes place on a train. It's better than number 17. So I like the acting in this film. The set pieces when they're running through the warehouses are very fun. It's a fun film. It's a fun, exciting film. It's not as memorable, so that's why it's still in the rubbish tier. Moving on to number 33 is The Paradigm Case. And now this film stars Gregory Peck. Probably the biggest actor we've talked about at this time. I know in Secret Agent, there was Peter Lorre in Secret Agent. Yeah, it's Peter Lorre, and then it's Gregory Peck. Those are probably Alfred Hitchcock's biggest actors that he's worked with up to this point. This film stars Gregory Peck, and Gregory Peck is a lawyer, but it's not To Kill a Mockingbird. He's a lawyer for the Paradigm Case, and what this case is, this woman, she's suspected to have killed this man. It's up to Gregory Peck to be a good defense attorney and prove her innocence. In the process, he ends up falling in love with her and becomes obsessive with her, and it doesn't like how Gregory Peck is handling everything. There's this whole blow up that takes place like in the courtroom near the end. It's pretty okay. Like the actress has like a blank face throughout the entire film. She's not really giving it a lot, I don't think, in my opinion. Gregory Peck does a fine job as an actor. It's a fun procedural, but I'm never gonna watch this film again. The films that we've previously talked about are films that I'll probably never watch again. They're kind of just one-offs that I need to get through to watch all of Alfred Hitchcock's work, and The Paradigm Case is no exception. It's a fun procedural courtroom drama, but it doesn't have a lot to say, and Gregory Peck's character slowly becomes less likable, even though it is Gregory Peck, and the actress kind of puts on a wooden performance, but the drama is very exciting and engaging. So I think for that respect, it's at the top of rubbish tier. We're gonna move on to the good evening tier. Now, this tier is where the films start to get very good and very entertaining. Up to this point, I probably wouldn't rewatch any of the other films that we've previously talked about. However, now that we're at the good evening tier, we're getting to the films that I could see myself watching again. The 32nd film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, Topaz. Topaz is a film about espionage and spies. The beginning of the film is a pretty suspenseful and really cool sequence. They try to make their move to like escape, but then this like stroller gets in the way of the daughter, and then the daughter falls over and trips, and you're worried, you're really stressed out of whether or not the daughter is going to make it or not in that moment. I think that's a successful moment of suspense from Alfred Hitchcock. I also like how this film's kind of very over engrossing. There's a lot of different perspectives and different locations throughout the film, and it's kind of like a film noir in a sense where there's so much plot and small details they have to get through that it's hard to follow. Columbo's also in the film. He has a small part, but when I saw that, I was like, ooh, Columbo, that's fun. A part of that, like the characters are kind of washboards again. When the characters split up, you don't really care. Topaz is the longest Alfred Hitchcock movie, by the way. It's 2 hours and 23 minutes. So Hitchcock's longest film is 2 hours and 23 minutes, which shows you just how condensed of a filmmaker he really was. I like Topaz in that respect, but because the characters aren't as fleshed out, because, you know, the narrative isn't as wound tight as other Hitchcock films, that's why it's at the bottom of the good evening tier. I was debating whether to put Topaz in good evening or in rubbish, but I decided to put it in good evening because I still like the quality of the filmmaking in this film. Number 31 is Jamaica Inn. Now, this is actually a really cool movie, Jamaica Inn. It's about this girl who goes to like this inn and stays there, but while she's staying there, a whole bunch of criminals come to the inn too, to plan their next crime or to talk about the previous crime that already happened. And she hears like all of the crimes and evidence. They catch wind that she knows about their crimes, because then later she like escapes the inn and then she goes to like this respectable gentleman's house and then tells him of what she heard. But it turns out that respectable gentleman is actually the guy behind all the crimes to begin with. So she's confessing to the criminal. That's interesting. The reason why she's there is because she's related to the inn owner who's also involved in the crimes. And so there's that moral dilemma of that character has to decide, oh, do I pick my family or do I pick a life of crime? This film has different locations, but mostly takes place in the Jamaica Inn. And I think they do a really good job with the blocking and the setting, where they kind of use the space in a very dynamic way that's less like Juno and the Paycock and more like an Alfred Hitchcock proper film. Definitely check out Jamaica Inn. The 30th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1931. He remakes this film later on. Now, this film also again stars Peter Lorre. He was in Secret Agent, and this film is about this couple who goes on to this business conference. During this business conference, their son gets kidnapped, and they have a message from the kidnappers that's saying their son is kidnapped, and they have to work with the kidnappers to try and get him back. And the whole story is discovering who kidnapped him and why did they kidnap him at that specific time and location. It's a very fun, exciting film. I like A Man Who Knew Too Much because you're kind of just thrown into the story, because you kind of see little pieces of details like, oh, why did he show us that? Oh, why he showed us that? And then you get the note, and you're like, okay, wait, let me retrace my memory back to the previous scenes. Based off that dynamic alone, I already think it's a stellar premise and a stellar job by Alfred Hitchcock to set up a story. Peter Lorre is actually very good in the film. He does a tremendous job. The 29th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, Suspicion. Now, Suspicion is one of the many times that Alfred Hitchcock will team up with one of his best pals, Cary Grant, and Alfred Hitchcock and Cary Grant, also Alfred Hitchcock and Jimmy Stewart, have like a very good chemistry together. Alfred Hitchcock does a very good job with very talented leading men. But this film stars Joan Fontaine, and what this film is trying to guess is Cary Grant gonna kill Joan Fontaine, or is Cary Grant just a good person? Throughout the entire film, Joan Fontaine is with Cary Grant. Joan Fontaine's character has this suspicion that Cary Grant wants to murder her. Each scene is Alfred Hitchcock teasing you to the fact that Cary Grant might kill her, but then doesn't. It ends like on the side of the cliff where you think, is Cary Grant gonna throw her off the cliff? But Cary Grant like reassures her that everything's fine, and then they drive back home. But when they're driving back home, he puts his arm around her, so you're kind of like, oh, is he gonna kill her? Like, we don't know. This is Quentin Tarantino's favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie. He's not a huge fan of Alfred Hitchcock, but this one is his personal favorite. I'm kind of surprised by that, because I think there's a ton of other films that are better than Suspicion. Suspicion's kind of one note in terms of you're only wondering whether or not Cary Grant's gonna kill Joan Fontaine. That's the entire film. There's nothing else going for the film besides you questioning that. But that does like create some sort of engagement. But in my opinion, I think this is probably the worst Cary Grant Alfred Hitchcock film out of the 4 that we'll talk about. The 28th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Saboteur. I would say Saboteur is Diet North by Northwest. If you look at the skeleton of Saboteur and the skeleton of North by Northwest, it's near identical. It's about this man that gets wrongfully thrown into this crazy conspiracy or crime conspiracy, but he has nothing to do with it. And then it's about him trying to one up the criminals, and it takes place at a very historical American landmark, similar to how the entire film of North by Northwest plays out. But instead of, Mount Rushmore, it's the Statue of Liberty. The reason why it's so low is because I feel like North by Northwest is such a more polished film, and Saboteur it's very good. It's a very good film. It's very good. It's definitely something that, I can see myself rewatching. The bad guy is very, very good. but it's just not as good as the rest of his films. I guess my one thing about Saboteur that I think kind of bogs it down, and it takes a second for the plot to really kick up and going, where I think North by Northwest starts the film quicker and stronger in that respect. But in Saboteur, I think you kind of need like a scene or two to kind of get the ball rolling. The 27th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Stage Fright. It stars Jane Wyman and Marlene Dietrich. It's about this guy who's being accused of killing a person for Marlene Dietrich's character. His defense was that he didn't do it, or that he only did it because of Marlene Dietrich's character told him to. And so Jane Wyman's character is trying to help this man throughout the entire time and give him shelter and refuge from the police, while she tries to get the confession out of Marlene Dietrich's character. But she ends up not being able to get the confession out of Marlene Dietrich's character. And there's a really good carnival set. Jane Wyman's dad is also trying to help her too, and she's trying to give her voice of reason, hey, you're helping this guy out, but you don't really know what kind of person he is. And so, spoiler alert, the climax of the film is actually really engaging. You realize this guy who has been wrongfully accused of murder this entire time is actually a murderer. Jane Wyman realizes that at the last second when they're alone. At that point, she kind of breaks off from him and decides to go against him in that moment. And I think that's a really good character moment, and it's a really good story moment, because it kind of throws the suspected twist on its head. Because usually you think a guy is innocent and then he's accused of being guilty, but this guy is being accused of being guilty, but you think he's innocent until the very end when you realize he actually is guilty. That was surprising in that respect, and I like the performances by Marlene Dietrich and Jane Wyman, and I like the carnival scene too. I think that was really well done, and I really like the twist at the end too. Number 26, To Catch a Thief. Now, To Catch a Thief is the next Cary Grant film that we'll be talking about, and it's the first Grace Kelly film that we'll be talking about. This film stars, obviously, Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, and it's about this expert jewel thief, or thief in Cary Grant, who's retired at this point. But the film starts with these guys going to Cary Grant's house because he's wrongfully accused of stealing something from, I think, the museum, or whether it's a jewel or painting or something like that. What Cary Grant does at the beginning of the film is they're at his house, but then he runs away and they kind of chase him, and he kind of gives them the slip, but then they're chasing him throughout this whole place, the whole surrounding area. But then he ends up circling back to his house, and then he sits back at his house, and then he decides to have a conversation with the police. So this whole beginning with him getting chased by the police is him just kind of dicking around with the police officers, which is kind of funny, but you're kind of left hey, why do we even need to have this scene? Can we just get the story going? But then Cary Grant agrees to help. The production value in this film is pretty good. It's a fun film, and there is a reveal as to who it is. I love Cary Grant and Grace Kelly. They have dynamic chemistry. I love the setting of this film. I love the water that Alfred Hitchcock shows in the film. I love the countrysides that are shown in this film. I love the art that's shown in this film. The plot is sexy. I think it has less to say than some of the other films that he's made. The 25th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Marnie. Now, Marnie, it's a good film. It's a film about this woman who commits these burglaries at banks. What she does is she creates a new identity and a new persona, and then she goes to a bank, and then she works at a bank, and then she tries to then rob the vault at the bank, and then change her identity and start all over and repeat the same process. You realize early on that that's kind of what she does. The scenes where she steals the money from the vaults are very suspenseful and very well done, because you see her jiggling the vault. You pan to the other end of the hallway, and you see the janitor with the mop, and that's Hitchcock trying to tease the audience into being stressed out as to whether or not she's going to get busted or not. So it's a really, really good job by Hitchcock. She robs that one bank. When she's at that one bank, she's introduced to Sean Connery. Sean Connery is there, and he's kind of introduced her, and he kind of finds her attractive. But she robs the bank, and then she moves on to another bank. However, the other bank, who happens to be there but none other than Sean Connery. So Sean Connery recognizes her as a person who robbed the previous bank, and he's suspicious, and now he wants to get to the bottom of this. So then he starts befriending the woman and ends up falling for her. But in the process of falling for her, he realizes that she kind of has this fear of thunderstorms, and she has this fear of the color red. Throughout the film, he's trying to figure out why she's so afraid of that, because her fear of that is hampering their connection. Because eventually Sean Connery doesn't care about the crimes that she commits, but he cares about her. He's fallen for her. And so the climax of the film is him realizing that, she was molested as a kid, and that's why she has those issues. And then that's how the resolution of that is resolved, and she has closure with that. So it's kind of an interesting film where it starts off as one film, as a bank robbery kind of film, and then it transitions into a psychological film about this woman dealing with previous trauma. It's interesting how it's shifted like that. Part of the reason why this film's not higher is because of that shift, where I felt like thematically Hitchcock didn't really have a footing as to where to go with the story, but it's also based off of books, obviously, so it's not like he was taking drastic creative liberties. But it is higher because, the plot is still interesting, and it is a film that you wouldn't expect from Hitchcock. I was pretty surprised throughout the entire film. Sean Connery does a fantastic job with the performance. Tippi Hedren and Sean Connery, their chemistry is very, very good. I like this film a lot. I could probably see myself rewatching, but there are times in the film where I thought this is kind of boring, can we move on? But I definitely like Marnie. I'd definitely check it out if I were you. The 24th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is I Confess. This film stars Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift is, you guessed it, falsely accused of murder. It's about him trying to prove his innocence. Anne Baxter's in the film, and she's fantastic. And so is Carl Malden, who is another really good actor too. All three of them are in this film. They think Montgomery Clift is guilty of this murder. This one's interesting because Montgomery Clift is a priest, and what happens is the criminal actually leaves the church that night, and Montgomery Clift is aware of that. But then the criminal comes back to him and confesses. But the thing is, Montgomery Clift is a priest. So Montgomery Clift is bound by the laws of the Catholic Church, or from priesthood, to not reveal the confession of the murderer, which is tough for him because now he's being accused of the crime. It's that moral dilemma that Montgomery Clift has to go through, where it's do I have to confess? Where I have to give up this guy's confession to prove my innocence? Will that make me a bad priest? Does that make me not a good Christian? So he has that moral dilemma throughout the film. It's like a catch-22 conundrum that I think is really interesting. That moral dilemma is super compelling. You can tell Hitchcock really was fascinated about false accusations and people being accused of crimes that they didn't commit, because that's every other Hitchcock movie. The 23rd film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is The Trouble with Harry. What's interesting about The Trouble with Harry, it introduced Shirley MacLaine. It's propelled Shirley MacLaine to have one of the most successful acting careers of all time. What this film was about is it's about Harry, and Harry is a dead guy in the middle of the woods. The trouble with Harry is that everyone comes across this dead body and nobody cares that Harry's dead. It's about this cast of characters in the town that all come across Harry, but then leave him there like he is nothing. Later on in the film, they all realize together that Harry is dead, and then they go back to the scene of the crime where they decide to bury Harry, but then they realize that they need to unbury Harry, and then they realize they need to bury Harry again. This film was a comedy, and the whole comedic premise of the film is there's this dead body that nobody cares about. That's the funny part about the film, is they're kind of just moving the body around as if it's a Weekend at Bernie's kind of thing, but everyone's has this carefree levity to them in their performances, which makes it pretty funny to think about how ridiculous this movie is and just how satirical it is. And then there's one part when they bring Harry into the living room and then they hide Harry in the closet, and I like the autumn setting in the film too. And I like the different perspectives and different storylines that are threaded throughout the film as well. I think Hitchcock was supposed to film in autumn, but then the weekend of filming, all the leaves fell down. So what they had to do is they had to take a week to nail wooden leaves or wooden posts that had leaves on them into the scenes. You'll see the scenes where there's definitely real trees and real leaves, and then you'll see the fake trees and fake leaves. So it's kind of funny to notice that. The 22nd film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, and the top film in the Good Evening tier, is Torn Curtain. Torn Curtain stars Paul Newman and Julie Andrews. Paul Newman is this professor that moves to, I think, East Berlin to teach He drags Julie Andrews along with him, who's also like his teaching partner, but also kind of like his romantic partner. Everyone's asking why Paul Newman would do this, but Paul Newman says that he wants to, offer these people an education. You quickly realize that Paul Newman is actually working as like a spy to try and get information. That's why the film's called Torn Curtain, because there's the Iron Curtain in Europe, and there's also a torn curtain between him and Julie Andrews, where Julie Andrews' character is unsure about Paul Newman's character and what his motivations are. But then Paul Newman fills Julie Andrews in on what he's trying to do. This movie is pretty exciting. It's sort of longer for a Hitchcock film. There's this very, very good fight scene with Paul Newman, where Paul Newman is fighting this guy. It's a real struggle between the two of them until he ultimately kills the man. And there's also this really good suspenseful bus scene where him and Julie Andrews are on a bus, and now like they're at the point where they have to get back to the Allies. There's this tension between whether or not they're going to get busted or not. It's really engaging in that respect. We've moved on from Good Evening to Very Clever. So these are the films that I think are very clever for Hitchcock. And I don't think they're his best films, but I think they're in a top tier class of films for Hitchcock. The 21st film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking and the first film on the Very Clever tier is Family Plot. It's about the psychic who pretends to be psychic. This one lady comes to her and asks about how she can find her long lost relative to give the inheritance over to them. She tells the psychic that if you're able to do this, then you'll be handsomely rewarded. So the psychic teams up with Bruce Dern, who's like her partner, and then they try to find the person that she's referring to give the inheritance. In the process of them trying to find this person, the person that actually is entitled to the inheritance is actually working for this criminal. When Bruce Dern and the psychic come by asking questions, the person assumes that they want him to arrest him or convict him of a crime. And so even though they're trying to give him his inheritance, he tries to kill them because he thinks that they're going to get him busted. It's that dynamic, which is pretty interesting. Fun, exciting movie. This film, especially the film quality, feels very washed. The colors don't feel as vivid and doesn't have the same amount of depth as his other films. Yeah, Brewster is good. The premise is kind of funny. It has its comedic moments, but the narrative's not fully wound tight. Definitely check out Family Plot. The 20th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Frenzy. Now what Frenzy is about this guy. He's falsely accused of murder. There's this necktie strangler in London that's going around and strangling women with neckties. This one man somehow falls into being accused of these crimes. He goes on the run from the police to try to prove his innocence. Where have we seen that before? He goes to his friend to try to get his friend to help him. But plot twist, spoiler alert, the friend is actually the necktie strangler. So the friend sets him up. It's him trying to deal with that, trying to prove his innocence, trying to get his friend to be convicted and confess. There's a really good sequence in the film where it's from the perspective of the necktie strangler friend. The most recent victim that he strangled, he realizes that he left his pin on the victim, and so he has to go back to where he got rid of the body and get the pin back. But when he's doing that, he gets thrown into the back of a potato truck. It's a very, very good sequence. I think this film is very good showcase of Alfred Hitchcock as a suspenseful filmmaker, still like in his later stages of his career. Definitely a good film. Oh, by the way, Family Plot was the last film Hitchcock directed, and Frenzy is the second to last film that Hitchcock directed. I think this is the only Hitchcock film where there is nudity. I think this is the only Hitchcock film that was rated R. It kind of reminds you of like a Brian De Palma movie. The 19th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is The Wrong Man. Now, The Wrong Man stars Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda's character has been falsely accused of a crime. He goes to this bank, and then these people at the bank mistake him for a guy who stuck up at the bank earlier. And so they call the police, and then the police ask them for an eyewitness testimony. They agree to it, and they say that Henry Fonda's the criminal. And so Henry Fonda gets thrown into prison, even though he's innocent. And so the rest of the film, they have to go on trial, and it's a very lengthy, cumbersome trial that is tough for Henry Fonda to go through because he has so much anxiety about about being falsely accused. The real criminal eventually gets caught because he keeps committing crimes. It comes to the attention of everyone else that that's the actual criminal and not Henry Fonda's character. So you thank God that Henry Fonda's character is not convicted of this crime. But Alfred Hitchcock makes a point at, I think, the beginning and end of the film to tell the audience that this is 100% a true story that happened. And it shows you how concerned Hitchcock was with false accusations and how terrified he was of false accusations since he was a kid. His other films, the false accusation is an element of the film, but in The Wrong Man, the false accusation is the centerpiece of the film. So the film's all about being wrongfully accused, Henry Fonda's character. The other films might be like a story element to create sympathy for a character, but in this film, it's very much about being wrongfully accused and the circumstances of being wrongfully accused. And Hitchcock makes a point at the end to say, hey, be careful with your false accusations. The 18th film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is The 39 Steps. I think The 39 Steps is his first big talking film. And what this film is about, it's about spies and espionage, and it's about this guy's being wrongfully accused of being this spy, and then he ends up being handcuffed to this woman the entire time. Throughout the entire film, he has to avoid the police so that he can prove his innocence. And throughout the entire time, he has to convince the woman that he's handcuffed to that he's actually a good person. The climax where he catches the person that is the actual criminal is when this guy who has like this photographic memory, and he does this performance where he like just recites facts. It turns out like during that performance he also codes messages to like the audience, and there's a member in the audience that, you know, is able to relay these messages as secret spy information. And so they catch him at the end with that. The entire film is the relationship between him and the woman, odd relationship that they have as they're handcuffed to each other. That dynamic is what makes the film so good. Eventually they do get uncuffed, but it's at that moment where the woman has to make a decision whether or not to trust the man or not. Like I said, it's one of his earlier films, but it's also one of his best films, and it's a film that definitely catapulted his career and showed people the type of filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock could really be. And we're back. Sorry for the lighting change. The 17th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Lifeboat. Lifeboat is about this group of people that had a plane crash, but there's this lifeboat, this life raft, where all the survivors hop aboard. And so it starts off with, I believe, 1 or 2 people, but then slowly more survivors get onto the lifeboat. And it's about their interactions with each other as they're trying to survive on the lifeboat. And they come to realize that one of them is actually working for the Nazis or the Germans or the bad guys, because they were all on an airplane initially, or a ship initially. Then they got attacked, and they realized one of the people on the boat is actually one of the Germans that attacked them. They have to deal with that drama there. It's a really cool and an interesting movie. I say it's cool and interesting because it's kind of like a bottle movie. Alfred Hitchcock has a couple of bottle movies that everything kind of takes place in one location. Like Number 17 is kind of a bottle movie, but then they have the climax at the train where it's all takes place in one location. And that's exactly what Lifeboat is. It's this entire drama. The entire film takes place on this life raft, and it's about the characters and how over time their sensibilities towards each other changes, and that's kind of exciting to see the character development in such a short period of time. It's a very great ensemble cast. Hitchcock was nominated for director for this film. He never won an Academy Award, but he was nominated a handful of times, and Lifeboat was definitely one of them. It has a large cast of characters that you can gravitate towards. If you don't like one character, there's enough characters that it won't be a problem, which I think is good for the film. There's less to do in the film than his other films that are above this, so that's probably why it's ranked at number 17. At number 16 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Under Capricorn. Under Capricorn is a really cool film. It stars the lovely Ingrid Bergman, and Joseph Cotton's also in this film. And this film is a love triangle. This guy that goes to Australia, and then he runs into Joseph Cotton, who then invites him to his house, where then he is then introduced to Ingrid Bergman. Throughout the film, you're trying to make heads or tails of this relationship between Joseph Cotton and Ingrid Bergman. At one point, the main character kind of falls for Ingrid Bergman a little bit. However, that creates a quarrel between him and Joseph Cotton and Ingrid Bergman herself. And what the problem with the film is that Ingrid Bergman and Joseph Cotton have a secret. And the drama is that Joseph Cotton killed a man back in the day and then was imprisoned for it, but now he has been released from prison. The secret is that it was actually Ingrid Bergman's character who actually committed the crime in self-defense, and then Joseph Cotton took the fall for her. And that's how you have the dynamic of the relationship that they have, where there's admiration for each other, but there's also a hinge of resentment. The maid in this film is very reminiscent to the maid in Rebecca, where the maid wants to keep drugging Ingrid Bergman because she has an infatuation for Joseph Cotton's character. So that's kind of a weird little wrench that gets thrown into the film as well. But ultimately, our main character's job is to redeem Joseph Cotton and redeem Ingrid Bergman in their own ways. The main character takes Ingrid Bergman to this fancy gala dinner party, but Joseph Cotton crashes it and causes a big scene. It's a very dynamic film. I think the performances are really great. I think the drama is very special and unique to a Hitchcock film, where there is crime, but it happened in the past, and it's really about people's interactions and people's relationships towards each other, which I think is very refreshing to see in a Hitchcock film. I also love Joseph Cotton, and I'm in love with Ingrid Bergman, so whenever they're in a film together, I have to see it. It's definitely romantic. It takes place in Australia. It has a cool setting. I think the colors really pop out in this film more than his other films. The story is just captivating. I gravitated towards it pretty strongly. I know a lot of people have Under Capricorn. They're mid to low level Hitchcock films, but I think Under Capricorn's great. I definitely feel comfortable putting it at 16. It's a very good film, and I recommend checking it out. The 15th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is The Birds. Now, The Birds is probably one of his more well-known films. What The Birds is about is basically Tippi Hedren's character going to town. While she's visiting town, she just gets attacked by a whole bunch of birds. That's the entire film. The film is about just everyone just getting murked and attacked by all these different birds, and they have no idea why. And the bird attacks happen periodically and kind of randomly. It's very random and strange, and it kind of fits perfectly with Alfred Hitchcock's directing style, where he has this menace, the birds. It's a very fun, exciting film. I definitely recommend checking it out. The filming of this I heard was controversial in terms of how Alfred Hitchcock treated Tippi Hedren. There was a lot of psychological abuse, and there's that one scene in the film booth where she actually was attacked, and he actually filmed that. Knowing that, it makes it tough, but when you're seeing the film, you'd have to know beforehand that she was actually being attacked. Otherwise, you could have just chalked it up to a good take, and it doesn't look that real. In terms of the film itself, I think it's a very well done, suspenseful horror film. It's probably Hitchcock's scariest movie in a way, because the birds freak you out, and you have no idea why they're attacking you, and they're just so creepy and weird, and they just dive bomb these people. It's pretty intense. At number 14, we have Foreign Correspondence. Now, Foreign Correspondence is a very good film, I think. It's another film about spies and espionage. How the beginning of the film starts is that there's this man that's supposed to give this big speech at this conference. At the front entrance of this conference, our main character shares a cab with the supposed man that is supposed to be there. He gets out in the front entrance and he walks in, and they kind of go their separate ways. And then later on in the evening, there's an announcement that that man is bedridden and can't make it to the event, which upsets everyone, but they're not surprised. But it is surprising to our main character because he took a cab with that guy on the way here, so he knows something's up. And so it's just him trying to figure out what's going on, and he gets caught into this big conspiracy once again. A lot of Hitchcock heroes have that happen to them, but it's a very exciting movie. There's very good sequences in the film where they visit there's a windmill, and he kind of hides in the windmill and tries to hear what the other criminals are trying to say. It's a very good sequence and a very good scene. Also, the end of the film, it kind of takes a complete left turn, because you think they've solved everything. You think they have a nice resolution, and then when they're on the plane back to their location, the plane gets hit, and then there's a huge plane crash. The climax of the film is them just surviving this plane crash that just happens out of nowhere, basically. It's definitely a fun, exciting climax that really threw me for a loop. It's definitely a very good Hitchcock film. This might be Hitchcock's best spy film. This is like his second best spy film, I think. The narrative is very tight. The story just tells itself. You're just wondering what's going to happen next, which I think is important in a Hitchcock film. You're always wanting more. You're not second guessing some of the decisions he's made. You're actually very invested into the plot and the story, and he grabs you in, and then you're on for the ride. And that's what you want to see from a Hitchcock film. So definitely check out Foreign Correspondence. It's definitely a very good film that I think is underrated for the most part in terms of Hitchcock's filmography. Now, I think he was also nominated for Best Director for this film as well. Number 13 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Shadow of a Doubt. When Hitchcock was asked what his personal favorite film that he's made was, his answer was Shadow of a Doubt. And I think that's very interesting. I definitely like the film, but I definitely think there's 12 films that are probably better that he's directed. Shadow of a Doubt is about this young girl whose uncle visits their house, and the whole story is whether or not we believe that the uncle is a serial murderer or not. This girl has her suspicions that her uncle is actually a killer, but it's all suspicions throughout the film until the end, where there's a climax and a kind of revelation is revealed, and a kind of climax ensues beyond that. It's definitely a very good film. It also stars Joseph Cotten. Once again, it's Hitchcock playing with his favorite actors once again. The film is very good. It's very suspenseful. The drama is so good because you don't know what's happening until the end. Unlike Suspicion, where you don't know until the very end, you kind of have a hunch. And also in Stage Fright, you don't know until the very end, but then the ending kind of just turns all the information on its head. So it's kind of like a shock value kind of reveal. In Shadow of a Doubt, the reveal is probably better executed than the other two films, where it kind of just happens and you're kind of just into it and you're like, oh, okay, it's a very good film. It's a fun, neat, tight film. You have a sympathetic main character. You feel sympathy for her because she feels like she's being gaslit by her uncle, and she is 100% in the right for thinking that. Hitchcock thinks that this is his best film. I personally disagree, but to each their own. I mean, if he thinks it's his best film, then I'll definitely take that into consideration. Number 12 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Spellbound. Spellbound stars Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck, and Ingrid Bergman is a doctor working with Gregory Peck, who is also a doctor. The film is about their relationship towards each other when Gregory Peck is introduced as the new doctor, quote unquote. The film Spellbound won the Oscar for Best Music, Scoring of a Drama or Comedy. Hitchcock was also nominated for director for this film as well. When Gregory Peck's character is introduced to the hospital that Ingrid Bergman is working at, he behaves very erratically and very emotionally and strangely, and she's not sure what to make of it. It's revealed that Gregory Peck's character is actually not who he says he is. His mind is planting a false identity on him. He's giving himself a split personality, so to speak, where he's Dr. Edwards, even though he's not really Dr. Edwards. But Ingrid Bergman confronts Gregory Peck to talk about this and to understand where he's coming from, and he explains that it's due to childhood trauma that he's endured. And so the full film is Ingrid Bergman trying to help Gregory Peck unlock that trauma and cope with that in a healthy way, and also uncover what happened to the real Dr. Edwards. There's a scene where Gregory Peck's character is kind of reliving the trauma that he experienced as a child. He blames himself for killing his brother, but then he relives the memory in his head, and then he realizes that him killing his brother was an accident, and then he feels less guilty about it and doesn't feel guilt anymore. But when you see the flashback's him and his little brother on these guardrails on these stairs, and like what happens is Gregory Peck's character kicks his little brother off this guardrail of the stairs, and then he lands on a whole bunch of spikes on the fence and then dies. And then Gregory Peck's character is like, oh, I didn't kill my brother, it was an accident. But it's like, kind of still killed him. And then in the end, it's revealed when Ingrid Bergman's character pieces everything together, where the doctor who Gregory Peck was going to initially replace lets it slip that he actually knew Dr. Edwards previously, but then Ingrid Bergman's able to deduce that he would be able to tell Gregory Peck was an imposter from the very beginning, and then it's revealed that that doctor actually killed the real Dr. Edwards so that he could stay at the hospital. It's a pretty powerful movie. The dream sequences are actually very interesting in the film. Ingrid Bergman puts on a stellar performance, as does Gregory Peck. The drama is very very interesting, and their chemistry between those two are dynamite. It's actually electric. I definitely would recommend checking out Spellbound. It's definitely one of his better films, and definitely a film I would recommend rewatching if you have already seen it. Number 11 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Rebecca. Rebecca is based off a very famous novel, and it stars Laurence Olivier, our main character. She is introduced to Manderley, which is Laurence Olivier's like estate. Her and Laurence Olivier hit it off, and they develop a romantic relationship. She goes to Manderley to be with him. She keeps being reminded by the memory of his ex-wife, Rebecca. And so the whole film is our main character living in Rebecca's shadow and trying to like be Rebecca for Laurence Olivier. In the film, you get more details as to the circumstances around Rebecca's death and why Laurence Olivier feels so passionately about Rebecca. Also, the housemaid in this film is like pure evil. The housemaid does her best to treat our main character horribly and create psychological damage to her. And so eventually, near the mid to late of the film, Laurence Olivier reveals what happens to Rebecca. They try to sort everything out. It doesn't go as cleanly as they'd like. It ends with all of Manderley being set ablaze. It's a very dramatic, powerful movie. You can tell this movie was a novel before it was adapted into a film, because you can tell the perspective of our main character is really dense. There's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of information about her feelings that aren't shown through the text but are revealed through the setting and premise of each scene. Rebecca is Alfred Hitchcock's only Best Picture winner. This picture, Rebecca, won the Best Picture Oscar in 1940. It beat out some other films that I thought were probably better than Rebecca, like The Grapes of Wrath and The Great Dictator. I genuinely think The Great Dictator should have won Best Picture over Rebecca. And if not Great Dictator, then Grapes of Wrath. I think those films are both clearly better than Rebecca. But I still really like Rebecca too. Rebecca is a very strong film. It's a very dense film. It's a very dramatic and poetic film. I definitely recommend checking it out if that's more of your speed. If you're not so much into like the Alfred Hitchcock murder suspense kind of thing, then you have this very muted but emotionally dense story about this woman trying to live up to the idea of Rebecca. Now we're moving on to the top 10. These are the 10 Alfred Hitchcock films, in my opinion. Once again, if you like this video, comment, subscribe, let me know what you think about your ranking of the Hitchcock films. That being said, let's move on to number 10, Strangers on a Train. It's about these two guys who are sitting on a train together, but then one guy has this idea, because each of them have a person that they're complaining about who they prefer dead. And then one guy says, "Well, it would be interesting if we did each other's murders." And then the other guy laughs it off like, "Yeah, sure, let's do that." But then the one guy takes it very seriously and actually commits the crime, and then expects the other guy to commit his crime in the process. So the film is him trying to escape the other stranger on the train and trying to make sure he doesn't have to kill anyone in the process. There is very good sets in the film. There's really good scenes. There's a fantastically edited tennis sequence. There's also a fantastic carnival sequence. The premise is so unique that I'm sure it's a classic Hitchcock premise. It draws you in because you sympathize with this character who wanted this woman dead, but now you realize that she actually did die because of him. There's this level of guilt that he also feels. So balancing that emotional dynamic, I think, is what makes the film actually very, very, very good. The last film on the very clever tier, and the 9th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, is The Lady Vanishes. The Lady Vanishes is awesome. It's about this lady who gets onto this train. There's this woman across seats from her in this crowded train booth. Our main character falls asleep, and then when she wakes up, everyone else in the compartment is there except for the old lady. She's trying to wonder what happened to the old lady, and she's asking everyone else in the train, "Where's the old lady?" And everyone in the train says she was never there. "What are you talking about? There's no old lady on the train." And so the entire film is about this one woman just being constantly gaslit, because we know, that lady was there, something's up. everyone keeps telling her, like, no, you're crazy. But of course, you know, there's a conspiracy and she solves it. This film has a lot of really good set pieces. The beginning of the film takes place in like this hotel, and our main character, the woman, you're kind of not really introduced to her right off of the bat. You're kind of introduced to other members of the train that you'll see throughout the film first, and then you're pulled into the main focus, which is the perspective of the main female protagonist. You see like perspective of these two guys that are on the train too. You see the perspective of these other patrons on the train as well. And so it creates a fantastic dynamic. So when you're on the train with the woman, you kind of have like an idea of the other characters around her. So it creates an interesting dynamic for the film. When I was watching this film, I was constantly like, where is this lady? I was so invested in finding out the truth. I think the performance by the main actress is incredible. She does a fantastic job. And now we're moving on to the Hitchcockian tier. So what's the Hitchcockian tier? Now, these are the cream of the crop of Hitchcock films. What separates this tier from the personal favorites is just simply I have some personal favorites that I think are the best films. These films are my personal favorite Hitchcock films. So with that being said, let's move on to the 8th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, which is The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956. This is a remake of the previous film we talked about, A Man Who Knew Too Much, in 1931. However, it's 25 years later, and Alfred Hitchcock is a much more polished director, so he wanted to take the movie that he did and then rework it into a better movie. And he cast Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day in the film. That was a great casting choice. The film has the similar premise as the original Man Who Knew Too Much. Their child gets kidnapped in a convoluted espionage spy kind of circumstance. Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day throughout the film have to find their son, and they do it, but the drama is much more fleshed out. The scenes are much more engaging. The production design is a lot better. The editing and the mise en scène is superbly better than the original film. This film, A Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956, won Best Original Song for Que Sera Sera. That won Best Original Song at the Oscars. They used that song as a plot device. Each film that we talk about, like, the suspense just keeps getting better. It's definitely an improvement from an original film, and I think it has all the quintessential trademarks that you'd want in a Hitchcock film. Number 7 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Rope. Rope is a fantastic film. Like Lifeboat, Rope also takes place in one location. The entire film takes place in this one apartment with these two men who kill this one guy and want to see if they could still get away with it after they have their dinner party, which is a very maniacal and sick thing to kind of like wager and guess on. And so they hide the body, and then they have the dinner party in their apartment, and Jimmy Stewart is one of the dinner guests. And Jimmy Stewart and no one else initially is suspicious of these people. However, Jimmy Stewart does get suspicious soon after. And what's very, very, very impressive about this film is Hitchcock does this thing. If you ever seen Birdman, where the camera moves, it's almost like one shot, but it's definitely not one shot. Hitchcock does the same thing here. This is kind of like the first instance I can think of where they had the camera moving in a way that's kind of mimics one shot. Hitchcock does that to perfection in this film. He hides the shots in between the transition where the camera moves and faces a wall or something. It's very well done. There is one noticeable cut, and that's when Jimmy Stewart's character is initially suspicious. It's another very suspenseful film, because the camera moves throughout the apartment and you know where the dead body is and you know where the criminals are and you know where the characters are, but it's when they move across the room and they're getting close to different elements of the room, they're like, oh, are they gonna see it? I don't know. Or like when in the script, when the bad guys are kind of blowing it and kind of revealing information about themselves that they shouldn't, you're kind of like, oh, did Jimmy Stewart catch that? Is he gonna put two and two together? I wonder. And then it's just a very fun film premise and a very interesting way to tell a story that I think catapults this film to such a high standard. A lot of people really like Rope, and for obvious reasons, the film is fantastic. Number 6 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Dial M for Murder. This is another fantastic film. Similar to Rope and Lifeboat, this all takes place in one room, but there is a break where they have one just stationary shot in the middle where at a police station, and then they go back to the apartment in the second half of the film. So what happens is it's a murder. basically. There's a murder that takes place in the apartment in the first half of the film. And then the second half of the film is the same room, but then we're trying to deduce with like the good guys who the bad guy is. And the first half of the film is seeing the bad guy slowly sneak into the room. Grace Kelly gets accused, and then the second half is the same room, but then our characters that are still there are able to piece things together very nicely and deduce that Grace Kelly could not possibly kill the guy. I think this film is very great. The first half is I'm in suspense because I think I'm worrying if this guy is going to kill this guy. And in the second half of the film, I'm in suspense because I'm like, oh wow, is this guy going to get away with it or not? It's 2 levels of suspense in one film. Dial M for Murder is fantastic. It's one of his best. Grace Kelly, I mean, can you ask for anything else other than Grace Kelly? I mean, just put Grace Kelly in front of a screen. Like, I'm going to watch it. Definitely check out Dial M for Murder. It's fantastic. Moving on to the top 5. You probably have a certain favorite Hitchcock film. And you're like, oh, wow, this is Hitchcock's best film. There's no question about it. We're probably going to get to 1 or 2 of those films now. And so I want you guys to be aware of that. Number 5 on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Vertigo. Now, this is controversial because it's widely considered his best film, Vertigo. But I do think there are 4 films that are just objectively, or in my opinion, better than Vertigo. Vertigo is very good. It's about Jimmy Stewart's character, who's a private investigator, and he gets a client who wants him to tail like this woman. And so he tails this woman, and then he ends up falling for this woman. And then one thing leads to another where the woman kills herself. She falls from a church. Jimmy Stewart feels guilt because he couldn't stop her, because Jimmy Stewart has a fear of heights. Jimmy Stewart has vertigo because in the beginning of the film, there was this traumatic situation where Jimmy Stewart was hanging off a ledge and then a guy tries to save him but then falls off to his death. Since then, Jimmy Stewart has been afraid of heights, and then they use that in this film very well. And so Jimmy Stewart like lives out the rest of his life, and then he notices that the reason why the woman wanted to kill herself in the first place is because she claims like she feels the ghost of this person that's been haunting her, and that telling her that she must die, she has to kill herself. So she claims she's hearing voices in her head. So that's why she decides to kill herself. Later on, Jimmy Stewart's walking down the street, and then he notices another woman that looks exactly like the woman that killed herself. He ends up forming a relationship with this woman, but then he becomes very obsessive and weird towards this woman, where he wants her to like dress and look exactly like the previous woman did, to the point where he has her put on a wig, and then she kind of like creeped out by it. It's revealed that the new woman is actually the original woman in the first place, and she actually never killed herself at all. And that scene is probably where I have to knock the film down a peg, because I thought the way how Hitchcock revealed that to the audience was uniquely lazy for Hitchcock. Jimmy Stewart leaves, and then Kim Novak's still in her apartment, and she decides she's going to write a confession letter to Jimmy Stewart's character. So she sits down and she writes the letter, and while she's writing the letter, we have a voiceover of her like saying what she's writing, but then she looks at the letter and then ultimately decides to just throw it in the fire. So the only reason to include that scene at all was just so Hitchcock can relay that information to us. And I just thought that was a very boring and lazy way to reveal that information. Other than that, though, the film's excellent. Jimmy Stewart's dream sequences, where he is dreaming about the woman and he's also dreaming about his vertigo, are very well edited. They're very well done. It's very unique how he pulled that. A lot of people think this is his best film. It's a great film, don't get me wrong. I like the film, but it's not his best work. I know a lot of people like hated this film for like many years, and now I think like in the modern era, it's kind of been catapulted as like his best film, and it's definitely like up there for sure. There's no doubt about that. I just don't think it's his best film as opposed to what many other people think. But if you think Vertigo is his best film, that's perfectly fine. No harm, no foul. The 4th film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Rear Window. Rear Window is one of those films that you've probably already seen in like film class. This film is nice. It also takes place all in one location, but it doesn't feel like one location because you're looking into so many different locations from the one location. Jimmy Stewart's character his leg's broken and he's a photographer. He looks out the window at night when he's bored, and then he hears something thud or he hears like a crash or something, and he's convinced this guy across the courtyard murdered his wife at night. And so the rest of the film, he's trying to kind of catch him in the act or try to get evidence against this guy. He also has a love partner in Grace Kelly. Once again, Grace Kelly's in it, so you have to watch it. Grace Kelly thinks Jimmy Stewart's too uptight about their relationship. She wants him to give their relationship more of a chance and not, be so focused on his work of traveling the world and taking photographs. He has a housekeeper in Thelma Ritter, who's fantastic in the film too. And like he basically, throughout the film, he basically gets Thelma Ritter and Grace Kelly to like go to the apartment or go to other areas in the courtyard and kind of like search for clues and stuff to try to catch this guy for murdering his wife. The film was fantastic because you're left with suspense about whether or not he murdered his wife. You're left in suspense about whether or not they're gonna catch him. You're left in suspense as whether or not they're gonna make it out okay. And you're left wondering the status of Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly's relationship, which is very much the heart of the film. You think this is a film about catching a murderer. It is really about a couple learning to like each other. And also the film has like its own little mini subplots because he looks at the different apartments throughout the courtyard, and then there's the ballerina gymnastics girl, there's the newlywed couple, and then there's the piano musician, and then there's Miss Lonely Heart, who's very alone, and Miss Lonely Heart's character is actually very sad. But there's like 4 or 5 different mini movies inside of this movie that we're talking about. That alone creates so much depth for the story that it's very, very engaging. And the production design of the courtyard was very nice. And I think the main character in this film has got to be like the bricks. The bricks on the building, they consume the entire frame for the most part throughout the entire film. The red in the film is definitely noticeable, and I think it works for the film too, though. I think it's a very good stylistic choice. Definitely check out Rear Window. It's a stellar film. Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly have dynamic chemistry, and Thelma Ritter is pretty much flawless in whatever she's in. So definitely check out Rear Window. You won't regret it. The third film in the Alfred Hitchcock ranking is Notorious. This film would star the legendary Ingrid Bergman and Cary Grant, plus a fantastic performance by Claude Rains. The film starts in a federal court in Miami. A man is standing before a judge, being sentenced for acting as a secret Nazi spy. We quickly learn that Alicia, played by Ingrid Bergman, is the daughter of the accused spy. During a booze-fueled party, she meets T.R. Devlin, played by Cary Grant, who, while romanticizing the evening with her, reveals that he is a U.S. spy, and he asks Alicia to travel with him to Brazil to work as an undercover agent. She agrees, and now their plan is to gain the trust of Alexander Sebastian, played by Claude Rains, who is a Nazi hiding out in Brazil. Alicia successfully seduces Sebastian to Devlin's dismay, to the point where Sebastian proposes to Alicia and they are to get married. Alicia, responsible for finding Nazi secrets, points out that Sebastian doesn't give her the key to the wine cellar and suspects something top secret is down there. During a dinner party, Alicia swipes the key from Sebastian. Hitchcock creates an amazing close-up shot of the key. Devlin attends the party. Alicia and him sneak down into the wine cellar, where Devlin discovers that Sebastian is hiding or smuggling uranium ore in the wine bottles. Sebastian walks down into the cellar, so Devlin kisses Alicia as a cover for their ruse. But Sebastian is still suspicious and notices Alicia has swapped his key back into place. Sebastian realizes Alicia is a spy, so he confides in his mother, who suggests to poison her rather than kill her instantly. They are almost successful in poisoning Alicia until Devlin comes back to save her and also confesses his love for her. As they leave, Sebastian begs Devlin to take him as well for fear of his Nazi compatriots retaliating against him, but Devlin refuses and drives Alicia to safety. What makes this film very special is the on-screen chemistry between Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman. They would also be co-stars in the 1958 film Indiscreet. I think the narrative is very exciting and to the point. The drama feels organic to the situations
that are happening. The performances by the three main actors in the film carry my interest throughout the viewing. Hitchcock has a lot of incredible camera work in this film, from the close-up shot of the key to Cary Grant's silhouetted introduction. Notorious has everything you could want in a Hitchcock film. Its efficiency in compelling storytelling makes Notorious a formidable entry in the Hitchcock ranking.
We're now at my top 2 films, and I put these films in my personal favorites tier because these are my 2 personal favorite Alfred Hitchcock films. And these 2 films are pretty well known, so they won't come as much of a shock as to you guys. My second favorite Alfred Hitchcock movie of all time is North by Northwest. North by Northwest is the quintessential mistaken identity film. It stars Cary Grant, but it's about his character, Roger Thornhill. While he's out for lunch, he gets mistaken for a George Kaplan. When he's mistaken for George Kaplan, these 2 goons kind of like stick him up and kind of force him into a car, and then he's introduced to James Mason. James Mason is the antagonist of the film, and he's a fantastic actor. Cary Grant's like, I'm not George Kaplan, I'm Roger Thornhill, but none of them believe him, and then they try to like kill him. They try to like kill him by like faking his death through like shoving brandy down his throat and then trying to have him drive off the cliff, but then he's too much of a good drunk driver and he swerves away and then he's able to escape them. That's kind of like an odd, weird kind of way to like kill someone, but it kind of works because it kind of covers all your tracks, so I put that in terms of plausible. But then when the police try to investigate the mansion, they like refit the mansion and then no one's there, so that way Cary Grant or Roger Thornhill looks like an idiot when he accuses them. They basically like broke into the house and like are impersonating him, and like the police don't put that together in that scene, which I find odd. When Cary Grant goes to the UN to confront the real man, the bad guys like throw a knife into the back of the man's back, and then like everyone's around, it looks like Cary Grant killed him, and there's this really good bird's eye view shot of him running out of the building when that happens. That's just like one of the most memorable shots in any Hitchcock film. Then the rest of the film is him traveling to the Northwest with Eva Marie Saint on a train as he tries to solve the case and prove his innocence. Mid to early way through the film, we leave Cary Grant's perspective and we're in this office in Washington, D.C. This is the exposition scene where they kind of explain context to the audience. And in that scene, the FBI explains how they made George Kaplan up to protect one of their own agents. And now Roger Thornhill is being accused as him, and that puts him in danger. But they can't do anything because that then risks their own agent from being uncovered. There is this very intense and amazing plane sequence that's very iconic and very famous, where this crop duster is being flown by one of the bad guys, clearly, and they try to kill Cary Grant when he is just in the cornfield all by himself. It's a very iconic scene in the film. After that scene, like, Cary Grant's questioning Eva Marie Saint and her real intentions, because she's the one that led him to that specific spot. And then there's also this fantastic scene of like this auction. Cary Grant's in the auction, and then the bad guys are trying to cover the exits to try to stop Cary Grant from escaping. So the way Cary Grant gets out of that situation is by causing a scene at the auction and being like completely ridiculous and creating a huge commotion that the official officers actually escort him out, and he's able to get like an official police escort like away from the bad guys. So like that's kind of funny. But near the end of the film, Cary Grant's character becomes a hero himself because he tries to save Eva Marie Saint from the bad guys. You respect him for that, and that sequence of Mount Rushmore is just so iconic. When I visited the Academy Museum, we actually saw the backdrop for that part where he's looking up in the viewfinder at the Mount Rushmore. That was very cool to see. And we also saw Eva Marie Saint's script of North by Northwest. It was hanging on the wall too. That was also really cool to see. I love this movie. I turned this movie on one day, and like I just kept watching it. I was like, oh my god, this movie's fantastic. And then like I realized, oh wow, it's a Hitchcock film. I was just so surprised. Even though this film came out in 1959, it has the same ebbs and flows that you would expect from like a film nowadays. It runs that smoothly, and the narrative is so smooth and organic and fun that you're just along for the ride, and you're just so invested in Cary Grant's Roger Thornhill. Roger Thornhill's character is what I think a lot of what James Bond was initially based off of. And also, like, Cary Grant just looks so cool and suave in the film. He's amazing in the film. Like, he looks so dapper. This is the film that makes you want to be Cary Grant. Cary Grant is so dapper and smooth and charming, and this film, he radiates. He's fantastic in North by Northwest. This is by far his best film. North by Northwest is one of those iconic films, and it has a special place in my heart, which is why it's one of my personal favorite Hitchcock films. But let's go to my personal favorite Hitchcock film, the number one film on the Alfred Hitchcock ranking, Psycho. Psycho, in my opinion, is his most iconic film. The shower scene itself is very iconic. The shower scene itself revolutionized how to edit films with the insert cuts. I just love the performances by Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins in the film. They're both stellar in the film. The film is structured unlike any other film I've ever seen. The beginning is like its own movie. Janet Leigh starts off the film by stealing from her boss at a bank so that she can leave town with her lover, and her lover won't have to pay alimony to his ex-wife. So that's like a film in and of itself, that near the midway through the beginning of the film, she stops at Bates Motel and then she spends the night there. And then it's her conversation with Anthony Perkins' character, Norman Bates, that she realizes that she made a mistake and she needs to go back and confront the wrongs that she's committed. And so she decides to wash out all her guilt in a nice shower. And during the shower, she gets killed by Mother. It's obvious kind of when you see it too, that the Mother character is actually Norman Bates, and he actually does have a split personality, because we never see the Mother. So that's obviously what you have to deduce from the film. It's not a secret, and I think it's pretty well known at this point. But I thought the initial conversation with Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh was so good when he's talking about like the stuffed birds and his mom. You realize that he has like a hole in the wall, so that's really creepy. It makes you realize like, oh, when he stopped his hand towards the keys and then motioned towards the first key, that was going through his mind. Like, oh, do I find this woman attractive enough to obsess over her and kill her? And then like when she dies, the shot of the eye going out was incredible. And Janet Leigh had to keep her eye open for that. That wasn't like a still frame for anything. Like, she had to keep her eye open until the camera went away, and then she was able to blink again. Hats off to her for being like such a good actress that she's able to do that. I don't know if I could be able to do that. Also, like, the interesting use of chocolate syrup for the blood in the shower actually was very effective, because it came out on film a lot better. How the camera works towards the wad of cash that's hidden in the newspaper, which is kind of like the MacGuffin of the film, where it's like she has the cash encased in the newspaper and then she dies, and then the camera pans over back to the newspaper as if like, okay, now who's gonna see this? And like, it's just like interesting to see Norman Bates pick up the newspaper and just throw it away in the trunk and then push the car into the lagoon or the mud pit without even realizing that there was so much cash that he was just holding. One note I think I would knock the film off is when the private investigator visits the Norman Bates' house and he falls down the stairs. He falls down the stairs in a very unnatural, cartoony way, where he kind of keeps tripping step after step, where that wouldn't really work out like that. You'd fall and then you would tumble down the stairs, but he kind of trips until it's the last stair, and then he falls. It looks kind of dated and not that engaging, and so eventually you're led to twist, and the twist is actually very shocking and very suspenseful, but it's a very good twist too. Like, you can't go wrong with it. And I think the voiceover at the end is chilling, because then you get Norman's perspective finally. It's as bad as you think, if not worse. And the last line, with the fly, it's just so eerie. You get creeped out by it. But what mainly drives me to this film as the best is I like the unique story structure of this film. How it starts from one movie about Janet Leigh's character, and then everything gets thrown for a loop, and then that movie doesn't even matter at this point, because there's even more important movie happening right now. This film created a lot of controversy. I know Walt Disney didn't like this film, but like a lot of people, like the lines were out the door to see Psycho when it came out, and he was nominated for director for Psycho. So, but it's my personal favorite film. I forgot to mention Bernard Herrmann, who composed nearly all of Hitchcock's films. Also, John Williams did Family Plot in terms of the music, but I think Bernard Herrmann's music in Psycho, and shout out to Bernard Herrmann's music in Vertigo too, because that's also iconic. It just carries the entire film. You think to yourself, what kind of music would work other than the music Bernard Herrmann made, and it's pretty much nothing. Nothing else would work in this film other than Bernard Herrmann's music. Yeah, I really like Anthony Perkins' performance, and Janet Leigh is so breathtaking in the film. This film is just fantastic. It's so unique, and unlike any other film I've ever seen, I think this used to be what people consider like his most iconic film. It was only recently until Vertigo took that crown, but I think we have to bring Psycho back to the forefront as Hitchcock's best film. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Like I said, if you like this video, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and give me your official Hitchcock ranking in the comments down below. You don't have to see all of them, you just give me the few handful of favorites that you like, or let me know what you think about my list. Does my list suck? Is my list pretty good? Would you have maybe moved one or two things around differently? Let me know what you think in the comments. That's what the comment section is for, guys. And also subscribe to the channel and like this video so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.